welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so excited about our time today. I have the one and only Barry Kroll here with us, and Barry teaches in the English department at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he is the Robert Rodale Professor of Writing. Before coming to Lehigh in 1995, he taught at Iowa State University and Indiana University. During his academic career, Kroll has investigated the development of writing abilities in children, explored patterns of writing and reflective thinking in adolescents, and most recently developed an innovative approach to teaching argument for college students. In his book, The Open Hand, Arguing as an Art of Peace in 2013, he explains how the body movements of aikido, as well as practices of mindfulness meditation, can support a transformative approach in arguing with adversaries. Most recently, he's been teaching courses on outdoor literature, including the course he will talk about today, entitled Contemplative Walking in Literature and Life. He's an outdoor enthusiast and a fly fisherman, and is the lead faculty member for a program that will take Lehigh students for a semester of study in the American West in Wyoming and New Mexico, a program unfortunately jeopardized by the pandemic. But it is with great pleasure. Barry, I welcome you here. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. I'm looking forward to hearing all about your new class and what you're doing. And I do have a couple questions for you, but hopefully we'll just incorporate all that together.
Well, thanks, Emily, for having me. It's really great to be here. I feel a lot of gratitude and feel honored that you'd want to have me share some ideas with you. I guess I wanted to start out by saying a few things, not necessarily about my academic background, but really about my own personal experience with meditating and mindfulness. And I know when I started around 2000 because I was at a point in my life where I was made department chair, and I had a couple of young kids. I had a lot of things going on in my life, and I was very nervous about being able to cope with all the stress. So I had heard about meditating, had never done it, didn't know much about it. Searched around, found a book on the internet by Jon Kabat-Zinn called Full Catastrophe Living. And it was one of his early books about his program, his mindfulness and stress reduction program. And I bought it, I started reading it. And then of course the title appealed to me because full catastrophe, man, that sounds like my life, coming up here. I loved it. And, I just stumbled into it. I had bought a cushion on the internet. I started sitting early in the morning. I thought, see what would happen. And yes, it helped with stress, but really the long-term impact was something I could never anticipate because it wasn't really about stress at all. It was about getting to know myself, developing equanimity, developing a mindful approach to things. Not that I'm the greatest meditator or have fully realized anything, but it became a very meaningful practice over the years. And as somebody who loves students, teaches especially a lot of first-year students who are also at a point of transition in their lives with a lot of anxiety and change, I really began to see how important mindfulness practices could be for them. And I cared about them, and I wanted to share some of these with them. But here's something that early on I decided was a personal issue for me, or kind of commitment I wanted to make. I knew I could introduce them to meditating and mindfulness as a kind of add-on, and that would be good, and it would be very helpful for them. But I really wanted to see how I could integrate mindfulness practices into really the core content of the class, so that when we sat together or did a practice, they would say, oh, I see, that's really relevant to what we're learning to do, isn't it? I could say, yeah, we're not doing this because it's good for you, but it is. It's not because it'll change your life, though it might. No, that's not why we're doing it. I'm not out to do that. We're trying to learn to do something together that's integral to our class. So that was the context in which I began teaching an argument course quite a few years ago, where I wanted to shake that course up a little bit. And one way I tried to shake it up was to say, to put arguing in the context of broader thinking about what it means to be in conflict over something. And all kinds of conflict, physical conflicts, disputes, philosophical conflicts, etc. What are conflicts and how do people resolve them? And I wanted students to see that there's a tendency in our society to resolve them in pretty hostile ways, to become more aggressive, more violent, to try to put the other down, to overpower, to triumph, to conquest. And I wanted to say that while those could be useful and sometimes were legitimate, there was another way to go. And this other way to go was based on listening carefully to others, understanding where they're coming from, and trying to find ways of harmonizing different points of view. To get to that, I drew on something else that began to enter my life just a few years after I began meditating, and that was the practice of aikido, a really interesting Japanese martial art that's often called the art of peace, and that puts a high priority on resolving conflicts by harmonizing the energy of the two participants. No one, you don't harm the other person, even an attacker, if at all possible. You try to diffuse the attack and change the conflict into something productive. And I tried to use this in my class as a metaphor for a different kind of arguing, even in written argument, in kind of writing arguments about controversial issues. You didn't have to go on the offensive. I don't want to go off too far in that because I don't really want to talk about that today. But it was part of a kind of project that I had of trying to say, why are we doing mindfulness practices? Why are we moving around in these weird circles? Well, because I'm trying to teach you a way of arguing that ultimately is the way I'm going to ask you to argue in your written assignments, in your papers. And I had a tremendously good time. The students loved it. We did lots of activities and, so forth. And the thing that the component of the class, though, that really stuck with them, I'd say, was the mindfulness component. Many of them said, I don't know what I'm going to remember about arguing, but I'll never forget the experience I had when I learned to quiet my mind, free myself from distraction, pay attention to other people, and really listen. Listening became such a huge deal for them. Many stories I could tell students who wrote in their journals about how they listened for the first time to a parent or listened to somebody they'd really been in conflict with, and suddenly they saw them in a new light and they understood and they were able to communicate. At any rate, I had a great time with that class. And, I spent a lot of time over a number of years refining it and working with it. But the other project that I've worked on where I've again tried, the common theme is I'm trying again to find a way to work contemplative practices into a class in a way that's tightly integrated with the aims and the content of the course. So again, a couple of years ago, I started teaching some lit classes. I don't mostly teach literature. I mostly teach writing, but I teach, a few literature classes as well, usually writing intensive ones. I was teaching some courses called outdoor literature. And they were pretty popular with students who were outdoorsy and sometimes seniors who were in the engineering college and hadn't been able to take a course in a long time they really loved came and said, oh boy, outdoor literature. So we read some great books, had some good times. But one of the central concepts that I tried to work in that class is that there are two kind of fundamental impulses that one can find in outdoor stories, whether they're true stories or made up stories, not fiction. And that is what I call the competitive impulse and the contemplative impulse. The competitive impulse is the idea of striving, achieving, conquering, being the best, being the first, being the fastest, that highly competitive impulse, achieving great things by putting yourself up against a big challenge. So that's one strand. And I don't say that's a bad thing. I think there's a tremendous amount of good in that kind of competitive spirit and that sort of facing a challenge. But I tried to contrast it with another strand that I see in a lot of the literature. In fact, some of the books that have that competitive strand in the dominant part of the text have a kind of subtext that I would call contemplative. And I wanted students to see what that was and understand it. And part of it was to read some texts where that was the dominant thread, where it was really about the contemplative aims rather than the competitive ones. And as we talked about that, we didn't really do any contemplative practice in that class. It was really just a lit class, but I became more and more interested in this contemplative element. And so the light bulb went on. I said, well, maybe I should just teach a class where all we do is the contemplative strand, and let's do contemplative practice. So students really understand it, because I found in that general outdoor lit class, students kind of got it as an intellectual level. They could understand what the contemplative impulse was, but they didn't really know it as an experiential level. So that led me to my most recent project, which I just have done once this past fall. And that's a course that I called Contemplative Walking or Hiking in Literature and Life. So I put the contemplative in, and I put literature and life in to say, we're going to read some books that approach walking and hiking from a contemplative perspective, but we're going to live this too. We're going to do it. We're going to learn what the contemplative practices are, and we're going to learn how and why they apply to moving your body in natural settings. So that was kind of the aim in the project. And, I worked hard on finding the right stuff to put into it, gave it a shot this fall. A lot of things worked well. Some things didn't work well, but, it was an experiment. It was the first time through. So I thought I'm going to pause for a second so Emily can interject something if she wants to, but I thought what I would do for a bit is just talk about that class, because it's kind of fresh in my mind. It's the most exciting thing that I've done recently. And I think it's kind of unusual. I don't think there's a lot of classes like that around, as far as I can tell.
Well, no, and I mean, I sent you some pictures of Green River College campus, and I think that something like that would go really well at at our campus as well. But what I want to know is, did you learn the material along with the students? So did you do and learn while you were walking and doing the course, or did you go through all the reading material in advance and then adapt it to the class? Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes we learn along with our students, right? And
I think it was a little of both. I think it was
yeah,
a little of both. I did have a lot of it planned. I mean, part of it came out of that earlier course where I had discovered, I think in the first class, the outdoor lit, where I was talking about the competitive and the contemplative, I sort of had that bright idea, but I didn't have that all worked out. And so by reading those texts with the students, I began really to pay attention and notice it much more than I expected to. And I think that led me then to the second course, which is to say, what if we really focused in on this?
yeah,
And, I had some techniques and things at hand, because I had taught contemplative practice in my writing classes before, and I used many of the same kinds of exercises and so forth. But I did use, I used two of the texts that sort of provided the theoretical framework I had never taught before. They were fresh for me. I had just discovered them. And I was kind of working through them a step ahead of the students. I mean, we were going through them together. So yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. And I had no idea how it would go. You're always being surprised by something. So,
well, and
just
that's one of the parts that I love about teaching in higher ed, right? I mean, that is that we're these constant lifelong learners, and I think that just as lifelong learners, there's an element of contemplative nature
yeah,
to that.
yeah.
I think within all of us in higher ed, that we're looking at the ways, especially the meta processes and the ways that we learn what we learn and all those kind of things. But I wonder too, what you do in your without in the class when you're in nature. What does your practice look like when you're in nature without being with the class? Is it the same? Specifics, what do you do to make meaning and to use those contemplative meditative practices when you're out on the trails or fishing, or what it
Yeah.
is you're doing? I want to know what that looks
Well,
like.
it's a great question. I don't know that I have a fantastic answer. I mean, I think that is the piece of the course that I was exploring along with the students. I guess I would have to say, prior to the class, I don't think I was all that contemplative. in my practices in nature. I mean, I kind of was, but I don't think that figured as prominently as it began to while I was teaching the class and then subsequently. Some of this, there were some new concepts I came across that I'm going to talk about in a bit, and they really revolutionized my way of thinking about this. But I'm going to have to back into them a little bit and lay them out. So maybe I'll just do that. Okay.
Yeah, just do it.
So this contemplative, I call it contemplative walking because I didn't want students to feel like they had to hike long distances. And one of the points I tried to make is you can do a contemplative hike for a very short distance in a town. This is all, it's possible. We don't have to be, we're not in Washington State, so we don't have beautiful mountains. So they're a little ways away. And we're on a well, it's not really urban, but it's rooted in a town. And so we had to adapt it to some extent. At any rate, I came across this phrase, contemplative hiking, in a book that I really, really like. I haven't seen if you Google contemplative hiking, you won't find a lot, to be honest. There is a website, a Society of Contemplative Hiking, and it and the book are by the same woman. She's a woman named Margaret Emerson, and she wrote a book called Contemplative Hiking in the Colorado Range. It's an amazing book. It's very much about hiking in Colorado, and most of the activities toward the end are specific contemplative hikes and instructions for things to do to make those hikes more contemplative. Really recommend it. It's a great book. The introduction to it, though, is a chapter called What is Contemplative Hiking? And that just became an anchor for my class. We read it early on. We talked a lot about it. And she identifies some of the core components that she feels feed into a contemplative hike. She starts out with a great personal narrative about how she'd always been a kind of outdoor person, blah, 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 but there's some crisis in her life. She moves, she takes up a different kind of hiking, and she comes to the discovery of how it can become this contemplative practice. It's really, really quite good how nature can really nature healed her and opened her eyes to a lot of things. So it was this kind of general context that there was something called contemplative hiking, and I had this piece that laid it out and identified it and gave it an experiential framing. And then I said, okay, so ultimately what we were going to do is we were going to read two long hiking narratives that I thought illustrated dimensions of contemplative hiking. So we were getting to that. And these are two books I had taught before. I had taught them in my outdoor lit book course. But the problem is that when we read them in the outdoor lit course, even though students loved them, I felt like they just didn't quite get what was contemplative. Okay, it intellectually they got it, but something eluded them. So in this class, my plan was, I'm going to take half the semester just to get ready to read those books. And to be ready to read those books, I want the students to really start reflecting on what it means to be contemplative, to look at it from a number of dimensions, to have experiences so they know in their hearts what this feels like, to do some walking exercises, some mindfulness. And I want them to have a conceptual framework to really understand mindfulness in a deeper way. So I used two books. One of them was called Zen on the Trail. I just happened upon this thing, and it was kind of a life-saving book for me because it's exactly what so it's by a guy who is a college professor and is in religion studies. And he talks about, and a Zen practitioner, maybe a Zen priest even, I don't know. But anyway, it's very much about how Zen and walking go together. Throughout the narrative, it's a story of him doing a hike in Massachusetts, about how he makes it contemplative, about what contemplative hiking involves. It's a great book, and it weaves in a lot of background and a little bit of theory with a lot of personal experience. So that worked very, very well. He talks about, a lot of the book is about, he feels contemplative hiking has to be a solo exercise, because if you're with other people, you're going to be talking, you have to leave your cell phone behind. You have to let go of competitive urges. That's trying to be fast, trying to make distances. You have to let go of technology. So these are all things that he's kind of discovered help him. And he also then talks about a number of different Zen rituals that he works into his walking practice that for him make it more meaningful. And some of them are a little odd for the students, but things like bowing at the beginning. So when he leaves, he parks his car at a trailhead and he leaves things in his car and he realizes he's leaving them and he bows. He bows to the trail. And when he goes on, when he sees things along the way that he knows, he bows to them. So bowing is a practice. And so we practice a little bit of that. There are other little rituals and so forth that he does on his hike. So we talked a lot about those and so forth. So we're reading this book called Zen on the Trail, but it is something else I'd never done before. And it turned out to be really powerful, I think. I had a second book I wanted to read as part of this. It was another brand new book that I'd never seen before or used before. It was by Diana Winston called The Little Book of Being. The first book's by Christopher Ives, by the way. Christopher Ives, Zen on the Trail. And Diana Winston, who's at UCLA Mindfulness Center, has written a lot about mindfulness, pretty well known. This book just came out. It's called The Little Book of Being. And it presents a kind of conceptual framework for mindfulness meditation and a lot of practices, many short chapters. So what I did that was unusual is I had them read a section from Ives and then a section from Winston, then a section from Ives, then a section from Winston. And we bounced back and forth for about 3 weeks. And I found what was powerful about that is I think if they had tried to read either book straight through, it would have been a little overwhelming. I think they got tired, just as they were feeling like they were tired of Ives talking about one more hike up the mountain. We got to Winston. I was like, oh, that's really cool. And then so it might have been fragmented, but in fact, I felt that it really energized the reading and kept them engaged in both. And we kept trying to compare, what are these two people talking about? Winston starts out her narrative too. So they both these narratives begin with, or books begin with personal narrative, which is also really powerful. And Winston's is particularly powerful. She became a nun in Burma, a real renunciant, had a series of mishaps and difficulties, had to confront some real obstacles, eventually left, returned to, kind of more normal Western life, but became a meditation teacher in that tradition. It's a great introduction, but the thing that I take from, and I'm oversimplifying here, but one of her insights that I found really, really powerful in the course is she talks about 3 different kinds of awareness practice, 3 kinds of awareness. Now, other people have talked about these too, but she calls them focused, flexible, and natural. Let me just tell you a little bit about what she says about these. So focused awareness practice is essentially classic meditation. It's time on a cushion or a chair, dedicated time when you're developing your concentration, your focused practice. And for her, focusing on the breath is the classic way, and she feels it's a very good way, but she talks about other ways too, sounds and images and other things. So she claims that focused meditation is kind of the root practice. It's at the core of a lot of things, and that if you're serious about using meditation in any aspect, you ought to be, pretty good at that. You ought to practice that. So we took that to heart, and we did practice sitting meditation in class for short periods and progressively longer periods. Talk about it, how it would go, blah, 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 blah. The second kind of practice, and that was good. That was kind of solid. But I'm moving now toward contemplative practice in the outdoors. And the second type is a little more relevant in some ways because she calls it flexible awareness. Flexible awareness is where you allow your attention to move from object to object, but without flitting, without, you're not being distracted and moving. It's a subtle distinction, but not flitting from thing to thing or letting your mind race. But say you're on a contemplative hike. When you're in a place you're noticing, let's say a stream, and you keep walking, and then you hear birds, and you move your attention to the birds and appreciate them and really try to be present for that. But then you move on and you see a rock covered with moss. Well, that's the object of attention. So Ives talks about some of the same thing, about how when you're moving in space, you're not just sitting on a cushion, your attention needs to flow kind of seamlessly from object of attention to object of attention, but you do it in this way that brings mindfulness to bear rather than, ignoring it or flitting around. So she does a great job with flexible mindfulness. And students immediately saw that this was a way of taking the core practice of focused attention and making it more adaptable to circumstances where they were even walking around campus. What called to their attention and what could they focus on? Now, the final kind was also really powerful, and she calls it natural awareness. The term natural, of course, I loved because it's, of course, about nature, being in nature, walking in the outdoors. So natural means really not being in nature, but that this is a way of knowing and being that is part of what it means to be humans. It really doesn't have to be practiced or learned. We have it. Everybody has it. But it needs to be released or discovered or enacted, okay? And part of it is really just that the simplest way to describe it is the sense of knowing that you're in this place, in this time, and being just aware of your presence, aware of being. And that's why this is a little book of being. That suddenly you have this way of feeling, wow, here I am. I see this, I'm aware of it, and this is a meaningful experience, just to be, okay? And that's the part I think that personally for me became most meaningful, because I think I'd had glimpses of that in my practice before, but I started to really concentrate on, and that's what she talks about. She just pay attention and notice when that's happening. And I began to find that it was happening. And I think as I focused on it, it happened more and more. And so it became a really powerful thing for me. So for example, I'm out fly fishing. And in fly fishing, it's a very relaxing sport, but you're concentrating a lot of things. What's the water doing? Where are the fish rising? What kind of fly should I put on? Ooh, nothing's right, So moving around. So the challenge then is to just be in that situation. And I find myself now going to a stream and standing in the water and just being conscious of the joy and the beauty and just the amazing nature of being right here on this silly little stream in my body, just being here. That I have the opportunity to be and do is just kind of overwhelming. And it's nothing special. But it's just this consciousness or awareness. So we talked some about that too, and the students played around with that. So these three modes, the focus, the flexible, and the natural, kind of wove their way through the class. And we did different practices that tried to emulate them. And Winston's book is full of really, really cool little suggestions, practices that help them tap in. So let me move to one more thing here. I got a couple more things I'm going to say, and then I'm going to shut up a little bit, I guess.
This is so good. I'm taking notes, actually.
Okay.
I'm writing all this wonderful, and it's really cool because some of the meditations that I've led in this series that we've done, the flexible, I call those awareness meditations. Okay. And I think that though I like her term of flexible, though I've never heard it called that, and that's pretty. I love that. And the natural, that is, it's very awakening. It's a very enlightened way to think about things. I think, right? That it's this knowing that we are here now in this present moment, in this present place. And I love what she did. I wrote down the title of the book and her name, because I'll be getting those books for sure.
It's cool. I really think it bears looking at. Another person who writes about the same thing, and she actually references his work, and she kind of takes it for instance, Locke Kelly, who wrote about something he calls effortless mindfulness.
Oh, wow.
Effortless mindfulness. And he again says this is not something we have to work at like we do focused awareness. I mean, it's really hard to still. This is something that occurs in people's lives more or less spontaneously, but we can develop and make happen more often. So this natural or effortless awareness and comes out of a particular meditation tradition. But I found it cool, and I think the students liked it. And to be able to say something like, there are forms of mindfulness meditation that take some work and practice, and they're great. And she says they're fundamental. They are fundamental. She doesn't dismiss them. But there are other forms that are just inherent in human beings and human nature. They're accessible to us if we're able to discover them, access them, remember them. See, I had my students do one of the little writing assignments I gave them was think of a time in your life at some point when you think you may have experienced natural awareness.
Huh.
And she tells a story that her story is that when she was a little girl, this is Diana Winston, when she was a little girl, she remembers a time, I think it was lying in the sun, in a grass or something, and just being struck by, wow, here I am, or something like that, you know? And so she talks about how she always remembers that it's kind of this anchor moment. So I asked my students, do you have this? Well, they all wrote wonderful things. They say, you know, now that you mention it, there was this time, and I've never forgotten it. Sometimes it's at the ocean. It's usually in nature. It was that I was driving along this place, or I was at the beach and I was all alone, and suddenly I was overwhelmed with this feeling of presence, and here I am, and wow, they all had a story. And I mean, I didn't even know if that was going to happen. I was flabbergasted. I didn't even know if I could tell my own story about that. But it corroborated for them that this was a part of the human experience that was not, you know, everyday awareness or common, but that maybe there was something here that especially in walking alone in nature, those are particularly conducive conditions for having this experience of natural awareness. So Winston does talk about conditions that are conducive to realizing natural awareness. And there are a whole bunch of them, or some of them are more psychological, some of them more physical and natural. But being outdoors is a big one. So this really tapped for me then. So teaching this course on contemplative walking and literature life, this was a kind of game changer for me. And I really discovered this just a couple months before I taught the class, got the book. And so there are a lot of serendipity here. So all this led up then to a final unit where they read two books. And they're two books that I really love. They're very different. I think they're both contemplative, but they're contemplative in different ways. The first one nobody's heard of, but I love it. It's a book by a man named Colin Fletcher called The Man Who Walked Through Time. The Man Who Walked Through Time.
Sounds
And
good.
it's essentially his narrative about a solo walk through the Grand Canyon in 1963. It's not new, it's old. But at that point, the Colorado River was at an all-time low. The Canyon Park was actually a little different configuration. But he was the first man to take a solo journey from one end to the other, okay? And so he talks about this. And why does he do it? There is a little bit of an element of, he wants to be the first man. So it's a challenge. It's, you know, there's a little bit of ego involved here. But fundamentally, why he wants to do it is that he wants to, what as he calls it, walk through time. That is to see geological formations of such vastness and magnitude that he would help, that it would enable him to understand the existential predicament of mankind as being a speck in time, of just a very small piece of sand on an enormous earth. And so as he makes his way, he becomes more and more and more separated from the world of anxiety and machines. He becomes immersed in the natural world, and he becomes really fully cognizant of animals, of life, of the landscape, of the harshness of the conditions, but the water flowing, the sounds, the relics, but more than anything, of the enormity of time and his little blip of his own life, or even human life in the space of this. So it's a kind of existential narrative in a lot of ways, but it's beautifully written. He does it in a great way. And he comes out at the end, and he has to return to the world, which is to resume a normal consciousness. And he's empowered then to really act for the preservation of the wild and so forth. But the whole experience is, I think, one of the most contemplative narratives I've read. And to me, I mean, I think some students found it a little boring, but to me, it's a very exciting personal account of being deeply immersed in nature, but asking questions. He is not a contemplative writer. I mean, he's not a meditator. He's simply a naturalist who discovers what I would say is a deeply, deeply contemplative mindset by putting himself in these circumstances. The other book then we read, it makes a real contrast, is a book by a woman writer, Cheryl Strayed, called Wild, which lots of people know and have read, and there's a movie. But the students hadn't read it. A few had seen the movie. And again, it's a story, a parallel story of a very long solo hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. And Strayed was a young woman who grew up in sort of impoverished circumstances in Minnesota, had a lot of trials and tribulations, but the biggest one was the death of her beloved mother when Cheryl was in college. Threw into a deep tailspin. She becomes a drug addict, it turns to sex and horrible relationships, and does every self-destructive thing you can imagine, and is really on her way down. I mean, she is headed for self-destruction. And one day in a store, she sees a book with a picture called Hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, and has a picture of the mountains. And she picks it up and looks at it, and she just has this moment of realization that this could save her life, that nothing else has. She's tried everything, but maybe this is it. So she makes this vow that she will hike the trail. Well, she's out of shape. She's never hiked. She's a drug addict. I mean, she is not ready for this. Wow. But she goes to REI, and REI outfits her with all the stuff, and she takes too much. But she begins this. So the story then, the story is actually told of her starting this hike, this amazing hike. She begins with, in the middle of things, with an episode on a mountaintop where she's so exhausted, she's a little ways into her hike, she sits down and she makes a move, and one of her hiking boots, which she's taken off, falls down the mountain. She's left with one hiking boot. And she's in the middle of nowhere, and she has miles and miles and miles to go. One hiking boot. She has to make she takes shoes out of duct tape and sandals, and she has some great adventures. So anyway, she weaves the story of her former life and a lot of growing up as a young woman with this adventure along the Pacific Crest Trail. And the end is that it does save her life. It's a transformative experience. She comes out of it a different person. And I think some people think it's a little hokey. I think she's a great writer. It's a compelling novel. And I have to tell you, the students absolutely loved it. And it was wonderful, a book by a woman writer, because so much of this literature is male-dominated. It was a nice counterpoint to Colin Fletcher. And one of the final writing project was to compare these two narratives, to try to find ways in which, while they were very different, they might be quite similar, or similarities. Were also supported by deep differences. And the students had it wide open, and they'd write some great papers. They really loved writing about these books and exploring contemplative, contemplative hiking, or hiking for some purpose larger than just being the fastest, being the best, but realizing some personal, deeply, almost spiritual goals for them. So that was the class.
Did you take some hikes?
We took some hikes. We didn't do as many as I hoped. The weather got rotten.
Oh, that's a bit.
Every time I planned one, it poured rain or snowed, I swear. So we had some mishaps with our hikes. We did take two that were local and probably not all that exciting. But I'd hoped to do more, and we just didn't get out. But the student kept what I called what did I call this? A field notebook.
Oh, neat.
And, the field notebook had to have a certain number of entries, and these entries were about field projects that they did on their own. So we talked a lot about them. I gave them a lot of alternatives and models and so forth, but they would do things. So a lot of them went hiking on their own, and they would write about the hikes. That there were a lot did that, or they do other kinds of either some combination of mindfulness activity and being outside. So they did a large number of these. Most of them, though, were on their own. We didn't do as many as a class as I'd hoped, but the couple we did were fantastic. They really loved them. They loved them. And so this class has stayed pretty bonded. I'm still in touch with it. Fortunately, this semester, everything blew apart, but, I'm still in touch with them, and, they write me about their hiking. And so I think it was a really impactful course for them. And it certainly was for me. I love teaching it.
Is this something that you think your faculty would, participate in? Like,
No,
no?
probably not. I'm sort of the lone weirdo here. I don't know.
Oh,
Yeah. No,
but I think, hiking group or.
yeah. This is not Washington. This is not the Northwest. I'm not saying there's no one here who's outdoorsy. There certainly are, but there's not that same ethos of being in nature, being outdoors, and people don't wear hiking boots to class. I've been in Tacoma and Seattle and Portland and Vancouver, and it's a different world out there. The East is a little more hung up on polish and prestige and image, I guess. I mean, maybe I'm doing my colleagues a disservice, but uh, I think they certainly support what they know what I do to some extent and support it. Nobody is negative or anything, but they think I'm a bit of an outlier in terms of the main curricular objectives. And there are people who do mindfulness at Lehigh for sure. I have some good friends. They're mostly in other departments or other units of the university. The guy who runs the writing center here is really deeply involved, and we do a lot of things together. So there's certainly a culture of mindfulness, a small one at Lehigh. Other people involved. The Jewish chaplain is very invested and has been running groups for quite a while. But your question was about my department. I have to say, in terms of my department, this is not an orientation that probably, when I'm gone, probably no one else is going to pick it up.
Oh,
for better or worse.
So,
anyway.
when I'm out, I'm going to take this personal a minute.
Okay.
I think about, and people that are watching this, most of them might be follow me on social media. We're friends on, what, Facebook, whatever. But I feel like I have this, I don't know, I want to say childlike, because it seems, I don't know why we seem like it's childish to be just in awe of a thing in nature, and just, when I see something, I just stops me in my tracks. I might be running on the trail, and that presence of, to me, it's such a miracle that it exists and that I'm there with this in the same moment of that. And usually I take a picture of it because I want to remember it.
Yeah.
I'll stand there. My dog's looking at me like, "Hey, why'd we stop?" But I, like the other day, there's this little cove that I hike to, and I run the trails, and then there's this little side trail, those little ones that are just the best things ever. These little side trails that look really narrow. There might be some spider webs. Who cares? Sorry, spider. I'm going to make my way through. And I go down, and there's the part of the lake, there's like a little inlet that there's all these lotus. They're starting to bloom, right? And a log that's in the middle of that. And there were 3 turtles on this log. And they all were looking up at the sun. It looked like it was staged, it's like, it was almost like a Disney movie or something, but I just, the lotus, what's the, is it?
Lotuses? I don't know.
You know what I'm talking about. There was a lot of lotus flowers blooming. And this log, the 3 turtles looking up at the sun, sunning themselves. And I was just like, I'm here.
A magic moment.
I get to see this, and I experience that kind of thing all the time when I'm out there. And it's so, I don't like to use the word magic because it's natural, right? It's here and now. But to me, there's just this element of, I get to be here with this, that whatever's happening in the world around me, whether it's stacks of grading, whether it's social unrest, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's all these things going on, to step out into that, it heals me, I don't, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I need it. I have to, it's what's kept me going through this season, really, is these moments of nature continuing and me being there with it. And I like that's I feel like it's kind of a combination of all the three things in a
Yeah,
way
yeah, yeah.
that we're
Sure.
talking about. And
Hmm.
I would love to, I would love to see students aware like that, you
Me
know, in
too.
these moments that they can, because I think it's innate within all of us
Yeah,
to be there. And that I love what you're doing. This is just, it's probably been transformative to you as an outdoorsman yourself.
yeah, it has. Absolutely.
Well, and you standing out there fishing, I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. Those nature miracle
Mm-hmm.
moments where you see
Mm-hmm.
everything's just the synchronicity of perfection. These snippets, right?
Yeah.
I know that wasn't a question,
No, no, it's great.
but I know that there's people that I notice, and I get a little sad because I see them not being aware of what's happening around
Right,
them,
right.
and that is, you know, a fishing season opened not long ago,
Mm.
and we live on a lake like this, and you know, it's just this beautiful piece, and then all of a sudden, you
They
know,
all descend.
there's all these people and bags, you know, litter, you
Right,
know,
right,
and
right,
that
right.
lack of awareness of that present. I'm not judging. It's not that. It's just there's
Mm-hmm.
a different reality, I think.
Sure. Yep. Yeah.
Hmm. I wonder how you worked the hikes. Did you do it during class time with your class, or was it like a special Saturday that you went out?
I did the couple I did during an extended class period. Um, an extended day, and we would meet at the beginning and do the hike. I had about 2 hours.
Oh, that's
So
nice.
yeah, yeah. One day we had
Oh,
2 hours. So I used that for a lot of things. We did a lot of our meditating during that extra time, and on those days we really used the full period. So we did them locally. We met somewhere on campus, and once we hiked to a Japanese garden
oh.
down in the center of town, and we talked about Japanese tradition, how it fed in, and so forth. But it was really the walk there that was the big part. And then another time we went to something on the north part of campus in the woods. Um, that's a little bridge structure, and we walked there and we did some walking through the woods, and then we talked about bridges as symbolic objects
Ooh,
and
I love that.
how so each of them. So I did this little thing. It's a little hokey, I guess, but I rang a little gong bell, and each person walked over the bridge, and they walked up and they stopped at the top, and they thought about something that they wanted to change, a transition in their life or something they were going through, and then they walked to the other side. And then I walked over last, and we had tea and cookies, and we talked a bit about the changes this year, freshman year, leaving home, what's going on in your life. So that was one of the kind of activities. Margaret Emerson has a bunch of others that I've also done. One of the great ones, I just love this. I'll have to throw this out. In the fall, she has them by seasons. One
Oh,
of the things
nice.
in the fall is she takes a leaf, and I've had students do this. In fact, in the fall, I often have every student bring a leaf to class one day and talk about how we're surrounded on Lehigh's campus with beautiful hardwood trees. And the fall here is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, everything turns multiple colors and leaves fall. And I tell them, many of your classmates and colleagues walk through this campus in the fall and they don't even see it. And you say later, how was the fall this year? Oh, I don't know. I was too busy texting, or something. So I want you guys to watch and look. And so part of this was picking up a leaf that struck them. But they have to do that awareness again. They have to be attentive, they have to pick something, bring it to class. And we talk about leaves falling as symbols of letting go. Trees have to
Mm.
let go of something in order for those leaves that have nourished them and been very important to their life, have to be let go of. And they fall in this beautiful cathay. So I asked them to think of something they needed to let go of. It could be a relationship that wasn't good. It could be a resentment. It could be a habit that was bad. And I have them write on the leaf with a marker what that is, just a little code word for them only, so they know what they're letting go of. And then we go somewhere and we release the leaves. So Emerson has them done in a stream, and I've done that. I've taken them to a stream and we put them in and we watch them float away. I've also had them go to, there's a kind of place on campus overlooking a big expanse, and we throw them and the wind takes them and they blow away. And we talk then about that experience of letting go and of being mindful. And we do it in a mindful way. I'm mindful, my intention is to let go of this thing and to release from it. So that's a natural kind of, so Emerson has a number of those. She does other with planting seeds and other sorts of things all these seasons long, where you can turn your hiking or your hiking experience, your outdoor experience, into something that has a very sort of deliberate contemplative element. At any rate, that's a long-winded way of saying when we went to a couple of these places, I tried to build in, part of it was the hiking and the getting there and the motion, but then there was a destination too where there was something that tapped into the mindfulness theme as well. So anyway.
You've given me so much to think about today, Barry, because I've got all these notes. First of all, thank you for that. I just am just excited because one of the things that we really love doing here at Green River College is these learning communities where we partner with other divisions, other departments, and combine, have two classes. And we have a big natural resources department here, and also biology, outdoor biology. And I was thinking, oh my gosh,
yeah,
philosophy and existential class, when you're doing existentialism in literature and all that. I mean, I could just see so many really exciting ways to take advantage of the gorgeous campus that we have, and bringing what you're doing in your personal practice as well as in pedagogically in your classrooms into Green River, and I am super excited.
Well, I wish you the best with it. I think it's great what you're doing, and your colleagues are lucky to have you.
Oh, Barry, thank
Really
you.
are.
Oh boy,
No, I mean, that you need someone to be a leader and take initiative and get people together, because otherwise it doesn't happen spontaneously otherwise.
no, and
It takes some work.
it does take work, and even my practice is so profound as part of who I am, and sometimes though I think that that's a hindrance
Yeah, I hear you.
it's been such a habit so long that I kind of take it for granted in a lot of ways. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
And so some assumptions tend to get made that I just kind of almost assume that everyone does this, right? But that's not the case necessarily. And I also want to make sure that I'm always at a place where I'm meeting people where they're at, not where I'm at. And whether that's a student or one of my colleagues, or whoever, that I'm trying to, that listening that you're talking about is, I have students do that, and I have to remind myself of that because I have so much to say all the time, that to step back and to really be present in that listening and to really hear. Because I think so often, especially, I think all the time, but we all have so much to say that sometimes things don't get solved or things don't get resolved because we just don't take the time to listen to one another. And your students and your faculty are so lucky to have you, Barry. Oh my gosh. I've learned so much from you ever since, just from your book, The Open Hand. And I remember being so blown away that you came to my C's presentation in Tampa. That's where we met. Remember? I was like you were a movie star or something. I was like, oh my gosh, Barry Kroll.
Hardly.
And I even have that picture that was taken of us way back then. And I just really appreciate your commitment to contemplative pedagogies and to, really you've been very supportive of me as well. And I really thank you for that. And it's made me a better educator and a better human. So I thank you.
Well, thank you for saying it, and thanks for the opportunity to talk. It's really been good, and I hope it benefits someone.
Oh, I'm no doubt it will. I'm just super excited to get this thing up and going.
Okay.
I will be on the lookout if you. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to wrap it up because Barry Kroll has been here today, everyone, and I'm just super excited. And Barry, I thank you again for taking the time, and thank you so much for being here. I'm honored.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Bye.